Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for you for this event, and I welcome you today. We have a great webinar on tap, and before we get started with that, though, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the presentation, you will be receiving a link post-event that will allow you to go watch the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for either of our panelists at any time during the presentation, just use your control panel and submit your question, and we'll take probably about 15 minutes or so near the end of the presentation and go over those. And finally, we have count them, four polling questions during today's webinar. So we really would love to have your interaction, know your thoughts. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Modern Delivery for Modern Apps. Our speakers today are Andrea Crawford, who's Distinguished Engineer at DevOps at IBM, and Eric Minick, who's Offering Manager for Hybrid Cloud DevOps at IBM. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Hey, hi there, Charlene. How are you? We're doing good.
Great. Good. Glad to hear it. Awesome. Well, Andrea, I think you're going to kick things off, so I'm going to go ahead and just advance the slide for you and let you do your thing.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to get a little bit interactive here and do some polling as well. So those will be coming up shortly. But, I think in order to fully understand the context of modern delivery for modern apps, I want to take a few minutes to talk about what a modern app is. And that will give us a real appreciation for why this is sort of a unique topic. So modern apps are born on the cloud, any cloud, hybrid, on-premise, private, public, or any combination thereof, right? So the notion of an application or an app can be defined as a logical grouping of services that are powered by discrete components that can communicate with simple protocols like HTTP and lightweight messaging. So I don't know if any of you guys have heard about 12-factor apps, but that is sort of the prevailing set of characteristics of modern applications. And the technology is finally caught up with some of these characteristics so that we can actually develop, design, and deploy 12-factor apps. So if you haven't heard of 12-factor, Google it. It's all the rage and all the buzz, and 12-factor apps are here to stay for the meantime. I described modern apps as like born on cloud, or sometimes you hear cloud native. And from what we have seen with our clients, they're trying to get more business value from heritage applications as well by either exposing business functions or data that's deep in core systems. So maybe we can queue up the first poll question.
Sure.
Is your enterprise grappling with how to approach modernizing applications? So this is a quick yes, no. I'm really interested to see what kind of feedback we get here. And while those answers are queuing up, many of us, I think, are approaching application modernization. It's an architecture story, a new way of working story, and a new way of delivering story. So I think, Charlene, let us know when we're ready to queue up the poll answers here. How are we doing?
Yeah, I think we're ready to roll. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll and push out the results to everybody. Well, it looks like the majority of people said yes.
All right.
Perfect.
So
yeah.
that's a great segue. So Eric, you want to tell us a little bit about modern architectures and what we're seeing there?
Yeah, let's get into it. And I don't know if it goes into the Q&A section, but I'm kind of curious for the third of folks who aren't grappling with modern architectures, why they're here.
Sorry, I just lost the webinar slides. I apologize for that. I'm going to go ahead and get those back up for you. So sorry about that. Technology sometimes is not our friend. Okay, there you go. Is that where you want to be?
Let's see. I'm not quite seeing it yet.
Oh,
But I think what we're seeing, on the architectures as we fiddle with slides is, the shift towards, the
you want the slide preview?
microservices.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we can go here and maybe just
Okay.
advance on to the next one in a minute or two.
Okay.
Um, we're saying, okay, we want to be able to make changes more quickly. And I think we get this guidance from the 12 factors that we need to decouple. And that really points towards driving smaller units of kind of business functionality into their own independently deliverable elements. Now, that might just be, microservices running in Docker, right? It might be all the way down to functions running in something like OpenWhisk or Lambda or something like that. And so architecturally, I think what we're seeing is we're breaking things into a lot smaller pieces. We're trying to deliver them more independently, and then we're using cloud architectures, right? The dynamic infrastructure at the basic level to be able to spin up and spin down capacity for those components more dynamically without having to do that at the whole app level. Andrea, I know you're passionate about this. I know I missed things. Do you want to kind of expand on that?
Yeah, and Eric, that was a really good overview. It's microservices really are the next evolution of monolithic, sort of your three-tier, n-tier web apps and service-oriented architecture, right? So this is like the next churn of the crank. Microservices really leverage the commoditization of the solution stack. Think about it. With cloud, network, and hardware infrastructure is commoditized, it sort of doesn't matter anymore. You could even draw the same conclusions at the operating system and even the middleware layer as well. So microservices are really sort of the uniqueness at the top of the solution stack, pushes the variability of applications to the very, very top. And so microservices need to leverage cloud and that type of commoditization. So as we bridge over into the sort of multi-speed, businesses needing the agility and the responsiveness to react to market and consumer demands, the applications have to be small, simple, fast, nimble, and they've got to be able to speak easy and integrate easily with each other. So microservices are really coming into their own and really focusing on the speakeasy API interfaces that allow us to integrate services from many, many different places, services in the cloud, in public and private, on-premise, third party, what have you. And so it's that kind of architecture that is demanded by something like a microservices and the modern app style. Microservices are very complementary for container technologies, whether it be Cloud Foundry or Docker, what have you. And so managing all these little tiny microservices as opposed to one behemoth monolith sort of begs the question, how are you going to manage and deploy and have a life cycle to all these tiny, it's sort of like the difference between a hive of bees and a 10-ton gorilla. How are you going to manage the deployment of all these things that are being deployed at different times? And so that is where things like Kubernetes and control plane platforms will help us fine tune at a very granular level the way that our modern applications behave. So knowing that components can have different service level characteristics based on what it is that they're trying to do. So when it comes to
Andrea,
architecture, that's the way to go. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, Andrea, I think you hit on something really interesting with the API elements in that, if we look at how our apps came together in the past, you know, apps were big then, and in a real way, I think the overall system is big now. There's still the same kind of amount of logic, right? Um, you're still going to have some piece of it that knows about this part of the domain model and some other piece that's going to know how to parse some XML or a JSON file or something like that. But what's happening increasingly is in the past, we would share those pieces with each other by compiling a library. And someone else would include that library in their build. And so if we needed to update that component, we would do a new build of that whole system, and that would have to go out as one. But as we move towards this new model, we're shifting from compile time integration to more runtime. And so the interfaces that we're using are live APIs, and those have to be trustworthy because somebody is going to change some of the business logic or how I parse this thing, and they're going to do it through API. And it may be a third party who does this, or it may just feel like a third party, right? In large enough companies, right? Someone who's in another group can feel like there's distance from you as someone in a totally different company. So having the good APIs, being able to treat them as dependable and work against them is really key. And I think that imposes some new requirements on us as for each of our elements, we publish APIs. And kind of this intersection between lots of small moving pieces and API management is really key for people to wrap their heads around.
So on point, Eric, and we're going to see that pop up again when we talk about tools, because modern apps present some sort of unique and a stark departure from some of the more, I'll call them heritage apps, in terms of the life cycle and in particular testing. So think about how APIs are so critical now. We need to ensure that API testing, integration testing, becomes a central part of our DevOps tooling platform as well. So that's going to be critical.
All right.
I know one of the other things that you alluded to was, sort of, different ways of working, right? And, I think, I think we have another poll question queued up here.
Yes, we do. I'll go ahead and throw it out now.
Yeah.
There we go. Are microservices, APIs, and cloud the centerpiece of your modernization effort? So you've got two choices there. We got yes and we've got no. And we'll give you guys a couple more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close out the poll results. While we're waiting, I do want to remind the audience, if you have a question for either of our panelists, just go ahead and use your control panel and submit your question, and we'll take a few minutes near the end of the presentation, and hopefully we'll have time to get to all of the audience questions. Okay, we are at about 40 seconds into, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll, and we'll take a look at the results. Okay, again, overwhelming says yes. That's good,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah. That's definitely in line with what we're seeing with our clients, with microservice and APIs not necessarily being the only piece in your modernization effort, but definitely an integral part of modernization strategies going forward. So I think, Eric, we have, you mentioned before about new ways of working, and really approaching the build and delivery of modern applications in very different ways. And I think the chart that we're looking at now in terms of the modern architecture, this is actually, before we get to ways of working, this is actually IBM's reference architecture for microservices. And I think it sort of hits the highlights of a lot of things that we've discussed and that we still have yet to get to. But the notion that we can leverage containers. Notice we're not saying any particular technology for containers, because there are some choices and options out there in that area, but also frameworks. Think Spring Boot, Netflix OSS, MicroProfile, the wondrous things out there that sort of help our developers in the squads to sort of build in some of these core services and characteristics into the applications themselves. The fact that we're polyglot so that we can leverage, fit for purpose languages depending upon what kind of functions our microservices are doing is extremely compelling. The fact that we can integrate cloud services, the fact that there's security at each and every single layer in this reference architecture, and knowing that we are leveraging a commoditized infrastructure with elastic and virtual infrastructure to help us deploy and deliver quickly and be less reliant on platform OS specifics. And notice core down at the bottom, foundational DevOps, and being able to leverage DevOps tooling, platform automation, and a new way of working in order to deliver these microservices, right? So there's more around the context in terms of this reference architecture for microservices on our IBM Cloud Garage method site, where you will find not just the microservices reference architecture, but also reference architectures for DevOps and others as well. So we just wanted to point that out. So I think Eric, we can sort of move on to our new ways of working. So
I think so. And I think we've got one more poll question here around Conway, don't we?
yeah, we sure do.
Yes, we do.
And
I'm launching it now. There you go. So do you feel Conway's Law is a driver for agile and flattened DevOps squads and the linkage to modern applications? And if you are not familiar with Conway's Law, it says that organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. It's a mouthful, but hopefully everybody is in tune with that and can go ahead and submit your response. We'll take a few more minutes, or sorry, a few more seconds, and we'll go through but while we're waiting for folks to respond, one more time, do want to remind the audience, if you've got a question for either Andrea or Eric, please don't hesitate. You can put your question into our control panel anytime, and don't wait to and then possibly forget your question, because that happens to me all the time. So go ahead and use your control panel now and submit your question. Okay.
Yeah, I think the classic example for Conway's Law is if you go to 3 teams and you say, all right, 3 teams work together to make a compiler, you will get a 3-pass compiler.
That's a great example. I like that a lot. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We'll take a look at the results. All right.
Yes,
we got a
and
yes
no.
crowd today. So what do you guys think of this result here?
yeah, I think that's a pretty classic answer there. Conway's Law is interesting because it really links behavior, culture, and IT organization to a product, a software product. Holy smokes, there's a connection there, and we see it with our clients here as well, just as you see it in your place of business. So, I think the classic case for this is if you work in a siloed IT organization where dev, ops, architecture, testing, and business are all reporting through different structures, different agendas, different motivations and measurements, and this whole throw it over the fence approach. And it just fosters this whole, oh, well, I don't need to worry about that mentality. I think that's sort of a heritage pattern that we're really breaking down, right? So it's all about working with flattened squad structures, knowing that squads are sort of the new definition of a team, multidisciplinary, autonomous, hopefully co-located, highly collaborative. And they're doing things like employing the use of design thinking, agile, lean, and DevOps, right? And using those methodologies together. And IBM has sort of an opinionated conglomeration of these things called the IBM Cloud Garage method. And at the heart of it all, it evolves to a multidisciplinary squad, no longer siloed, no gap between development and operations, business and test. The squad has a product-focused mission, and with iterative delivery of solution outcomes that can provide incremental business value sooner rather than later, right? So this is really a new way of working when compared to the well, Eric, you've seen these, the typical waterfall, sequential sort of big bang release kind of thing that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think, boy, there is so much to unpack here. We've got 3 webinars worth on just this area. We've certainly seen, I think with Agile, where Agile both succeeded and failed is in transforming how we do development and how development works with the business. In general, development got much more iterative. But when we're in a situation where we budget a project at the beginning of the year, we still do kind of a big kind of, what are we trying to get out from it? What are the requirements? And we're kind of going through the traditional waterfall steps. And then in the build or build and test area, we say, okay, we're going to do Scrum here. Okay, we may have modernized that piece, but then if you still say, well, we have to hand it off to someone else to do a release, and someone else will own whether it worked in production and all of that. We've got, I think, a methodology that we see pretty common in the industry today, that the sandwiched agile. I've heard people call that water scrum fall. And that doesn't really move the needle as much as what we really need. And the real killer there is right up front.
Yeah.
We start with, there is a project which is funded, and we bring people to the project and they do the project and it goes away. And Andrea, you used one word that was a little different, and you said product. And I think that kind of movement from project orientation to treating the dozens, hundreds, thousands of applications we have in our enterprises as products that have product life cycles and product teams associated with them is really key. And Andrea, you didn't use that word on accident, did you?
I did not. Definitely not. And that is something that I know I've found with the clients that I've worked with, becoming a product-focused squad. I mean, living it on a day-to-day basis. That is actually, it's almost like a brick to the head. Okay, it is such a different way of thinking that I've often said that changing the IT stuff, the computer stuff. I mean, that's the easy part. It's the people that tend to be more of a challenge when it comes to transformation. And I've seen it time and time again. It is being product centric. It is having this notion that your product owners are in the trenches as part of the squad, okay? Not some part-time sitting in another building, off doing other things type of deal. It is essential that we work in these new ways in order to achieve the agility and the responsiveness that the business needs, right? So it is a takes a village, type of mentality to actually see these things through to fruition, right? And the fact that we have we've mostly been talking, I would say, more around like agile principles, but Eric, we also have lean as well. And the fact that we are iterative in our solution outcome delivery and that we get better every single time, right? So
Mm-hmm.
identifying where bottlenecks are in terms of where our delivery is and being able to use our tools in order to gain insight on where it is we could be better. Do we have a high build failure rate? Are we, achieving the kind of quality that we need to? Are we shifting? Are we testing early, testing often? And what are the results of that? And so getting better every time. It's that whole continuous improvement and being able to leverage the tooling platform from a DevOps perspective in order to gain that type of insight so that we can get the data and use the tools in order to increase velocity, quality of the delivery itself is also key.
Yeah, lean is really the granddaddy here that informs agile and DevOps, and I really look at kind of agile development and DevOps as almost customizations or riffs on core lean principles, right? You look at some of the really key kind of thought leadership in this space, and it's the Poppendykes talking about lean software. It's Reiner Stein's principles of lean product development and flow, and you even look at the Phoenix Project, first book written on DevOps, and it was entirely, an homage to the goal, right? A book on lean. And so I think that this idea of how do we really identify what's valuable, move that value from concept to customer quickly, and do that in a high value way, right? You talked a lot about quality, right? That feeds into this idea of waste reduction, right? When you ship defects, you lose money, you lose customers, and we really need to be focused on delivering value to the customer, better engaging our customers so our businesses win in the market. And lean talks about that pretty well and is really well aligned with business. And when I look at agile programs that have failed at customers, at DevOps programs that are struggling, almost universally, there's a thread of being too focused on IT-centric stuff and not being focused enough on helping the business win. And when you lose that focus on what does the business need from us, it's really easy to lose your way.
Boy, amen to that. I'll tell you, and when you add the capabilities around design thinking on the front end of that, and really ensuring that you have a user-centric viewpoint to the point where you're using things like empathy maps to really gain insight and understanding of who will be using the product and what their motivations are. That just sort of rounds out, from front to back, the new ways that we're delivering modern applications today that really do have a stark difference from that conventional or heritage way of delivery.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to come back to this idea of Conway just a little bit, in that I think as we're looking to transform around these modern architectures, we need to have a really clear view on how technological choice, architecture, org structure all impact each other. And Conway's pretty darn true, at least as far as I have seen in the market. And so, there are ideas like the inverse Conway maneuver, right? Where if you want your team to start delivering microservices, you break them into smaller working groups, right? Because the working groups will tend to own a thing or a small collection of things, and then have kind of APIs or negotiated ways of working with other groups. Break them into smaller groups, you'll get more pieces in your architecture. And so at the same time, if you go with a large group and you say, write microservices, that's going to be more difficult. They're going to be more likely to have informal communication amongst themselves, and therefore, um, you know, less robust APIs among the services. They're more likely to be coupled. And so this interplay between the org chart and the architecture that you get is key. And then it also feeds into how do we get development to do a better job of driving observability into the applications? Put them on call, right? If when the application catches on fire in production, they sometimes get pulled in, and the ability to figure out what's going on is poor, they're going to be incentivized in their day-to-day life, not like we're going to cut you a larger bonus check, but my life is better if I make it easier for my app to be monitored, right? Because I'm going to be able to get off that on-call interruption to my own personal time more quickly. And so these little manipulations are key.
There's nothing like having a developer's email address like hooked up in PagerDuty to give them extra incentive to really own the quality of what it is that they're delivering to. and that is something so simple, and yet that was not a classical notion that we've seen in the past. Talk about motivation, huh?
Indeed. At the same time, we know that developers are not the best operations people. I don't think either of us are advocating the whole no ops thing. You still need those skill sets involved. But yeah, let's abuse them a little bit.
Actually, speaking of that, Eric, we've actually seen the rise of actually a new modern role in the squad, the site reliability engineer from our friends over at Google. And they have invented sort of a new role that sort of bridges the gap between development and operations. And so the SRE on a squad has a focus around surface level characteristics and being able to basically automate themselves out of mundane tasks that need to be done, right? So I think in addition to modern ways of working, we're seeing the evolution of the team into a squad, and just an overall different approach in terms of accountability to the product. Again, coming back to the product focused view of delivery.
All right. I think we might be approaching time to talk about kind of the interplay of tools here a little bit more, which
Do have one more polling question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you guys want to run that now.
I think this is the time.
This is the time. Okay, well, let's go ahead and launch it. The poll is, hold on, I think, no, I'm sorry, the the answers got kind of all muddled together, unfortunately. It says, do you feel DevOps for cloud native applications, microservices, and APIs is different from heritage applications? And for some reason, the system clumped everything together. And so I apologize for that. I was hoping that we might be able to fix it before it went out, and I guess we weren't able to. So I'm going to go ahead and just close that poll, and we'll go ahead. We'll try and work on it our end. If we're able to get it fixed, then I'll let you guys know and we can do it again, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, so I think in general, the question was really asking, you know, in terms of tools and delivery platform itself, you know, do you feel that DevOps for born on cloud is different than maybe the heritage or conventional applications that we've known from the past? Eric, do you have a viewpoint on that?
I do. I think a lot of the principles are the same, but the complexity that needs to be managed has moved, and that can change kind of what the tools need to do in spaces. So, you know, I think a classic example is, you know, if the teams are fairly tightly coupled in their delivery, right? And there's hundreds of people, right, all kind of delivering together. When you look at what you need to do in the work item tracking, bug tracking area, the plan area, boy, you need some planning. You need some really great reports about where everything is. You're probably looking for today something that supports like the scaled agile framework really, really well, right? You know, when you're delivering as teams of teams and you need to line those up nicely. If you're fully 12 factor in your architecture and your teams are delivering independently for 80% of what's going on, and occasionally you got some big initiative that you need to line up, probably a lot of those features in a bug tracking tool around the scaled agile framework just starts feeling like overhead that's getting in your way, and you want just a really simple Kanban board, right? And if you're co-located, it might just be sticky notes on a whiteboard. That might be what you need. And I think as you look across kind of that whole tooling domain, you see that kind of pattern repeated over and over again. At the same time, you know, we already had a question about, boy, I moved to microservices. Doesn't that mean I've got more things and some added complexity? Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, you're going to need to manage the I have a lot more cats to herd problem sort of issues. So, Andrea, is that how you think about it, or do you come at it from a different angle?
So yeah, I think you made some really good points around the sort of approach for tooling. I think I want to make a couple of observations around when we're doing DevOps for maybe more heritage or conventional applications, we tend to be retrofitting the tooling around an application that might already be built, right? And so that is a stark departure from engineering automation and tooling from day one with a new, sort of hopefully born on cloud modern app, right? So it's the difference between, having a DevOps sort of in situ, being built around an existing application versus a DevOps tool chain that exists because it was engineered from day one. And so I've also seen a lot of trouble around return on investment with the retrofitting to heritage applications, right? Because it tends to be tends to be monolithic, sort of custom, very complex. You're trying to automate the deployment of a 10-ton gorilla. You need to heavily worry about release management. That tends to be very time and cost intensive. Whereas with the microservices style, you're really focused on deploying small, simple things. Small, simple. So your tool chain tends to be small and simple. But you may have many tool chains. But hopefully, if they're small and simple, they don't take a gargantuan effort to set up, right? Otherwise, you're getting like the worst of both worlds there. But I think that even from a technology perspective, microservices can be deployed using containers. And Eric, you mentioned before about the critical use of APIs, right? And so the actual tool chains themselves may look a little bit differently in terms of the type of tool that is used, but you still have a notion of a pipeline. The fact that you've got to go through checking out code, doing the build, running unit tests, running static analysis, yada, yada, right? So that all still stays the same. But when it comes to modern apps, you may have to start looking into things like security scanning for Docker images, API and contract testing for your APIs, and managing the API lifecycle as part of your DevOps toolchain. And that is something that may not have had to be considered for some of your classical applications. So there's definitely a lot to consider with DevOps and tooling for our microservices and sort of our modern platforms, cloud, microservices, and so on.
Yeah, and I think we have an example pipeline on the next slide here. I really look at this as there is a spectrum in the tooling, and I do tend to look at where do I have to do the most dependency management for my app, right? That tends to be kind of where the tooling needs to be most robust, which is also going to tend to mean expensive for a lot of the people who are listening, right? So if we look at where some apps are today and used to be, it was often in the how do I do a build of my whole system? And that tended to mean that we needed very sophisticated source control, right? In a lot of ways, if you look at Git and Subversion here, these are dead simple source control systems compared to what we used 15 years ago, right? ClearCase. ClearCase is way more powerful than Git, but I think for a lot of these apps, we don't need that power. We want the ease of Git. And kind of build management was really key. And then you look at, a classic distributed application, right? A SOA app. And there we had a lot of deploy time dependencies. We deployed new versions of the whole system was typical. And that's where we needed really strong release management tools. That's where we need good coordinated deployment. That's where my urban code release automation business is really strong. That's great. As we move out towards microservices where we're supposed to be able to deploy them independently, but we need to manage them, then the API management is where we're going to invest more, and probably, things like monitoring many different instances of things coming up and down, that becomes a much bigger deal. And so depending on where your complexity is, based on your architecture, you need fancier tools in that space and maybe less fancy tools in other spaces, right? That huge app that I built as a monolith and I needed ClearCase, well, maybe I don't need very sophisticated monitoring or deployment around that, right? Maybe that, and so I need less in some areas, more in others.
Hey guys, I don't mean to interrupt here, but that polling question looks like it's now finally working on our end. Do you want me to go ahead and push it out so we can get see what the audience has to say about it?
Sure. Now that we've talked about it,
Okay. All
let
right,
us know
great.
if you think we're crazy.
Yeah, okay, well, there we go. So the question again is, do you feel DevOps for cloud native applications, microservices and APIs is different from heritage applications? So you can go ahead and select from either yes, no, or in some respects, but yes, but the fundamentals are the same. So go ahead and make your selection, and we'll go ahead and close it out here in about 5 seconds or so and show and push out the results. And okay, closing it now. And here are the results. Well, that's good. Is that what you guys thought the results would look like?
Yeah.
I'm 0%
definitely excited to see those.
Yeah, 0%. I don't think we've ever had 0% before. That's kind of interesting. So, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and hide these results and let you guys get back to it, and apologize for the technical difficulties earlier.
Yeah, I got to say, it is architecture, though, not platform. In that I was talking to someone earlier in the week who's basically doing microservices as in COBOL on the mainframe. And their tool chain right now looks a lot more like what you would see on a Node.js little 12-factor containerized app than some of the other tool chains. So I really like it's about architecture more than platform, although there's some play there. Let's just do that one example on the next slide. Then we get into some Q&A. Just try to concretely look at a spectrum of options. Oh, we lost the next slide. Let's see.
Go ahead, start talking. It crashed on me again, so I'm going to go ahead and load it up one more time. So sorry about this.
Our go-to buddies are.
I'm telling you, we paid our bills and everything.
I think we all paid our Slack bills yesterday too, right? So, I think we've got these systems that are being pushed out, and when we look at our build deploy pipeline, how do you do a continuous delivery pipeline? So option one, and I think that you can probably hit next one or two more times to flesh this out. If you want the simplest build pipeline, right? I do a build. It goes into a package repo like an Artifact or a Nexus. I then deploy it to test stage prod. Cool. You need to earn that, right? The architecture has to be robust. You actually have to have decoupled things in the real world. That is serious engineering. It is serious discipline, right? But when you do that, you get the really simple pipeline. If you've got a fair amount of coupling, either because you've got a heritage app, like the idea of an heirloom app, or because you tried to do 12-factor and you just didn't succeed, then you're probably going to use a release automation tool, right? Where the first part of your flow looks the same. A developer commits to source code and you do a build, you store it in a package repo. But in one of your test environments, you say, okay, this version of this service works with that version of another service, works with another version of another service. I'm going to call that a name. I'm going to call that Bob. And then I'm basically going to have a pipeline that pushes that collection of things through the environments and knows to deploy each piece to its own part. We're starting to see a rise in scenario 3 here, which is I need what's in kind of bucket number 2 to a degree some of the time, but I've already got pipelines that kind of work or work pretty well for each of my services. I don't want to throw that out. I just want to be able to say, here we need to coordinate a release. So let's take everything in the stage environment and move it to prod. And we're going to do that by calling down to each of my pipelines. Pipeline 1 go, pipeline 2 go, pipelines 3 and 4 go, pipeline 5 go, and promote them all together. So I think number one is your reward for really good modernization. And then if you don't quite hit that mark, you're going to select between options 2 and 3. Does that ring a bell for you, Andrea?
Yeah, and I like the way that you put this here about how you have to earn the build pipelines, right? I mean, this just strikes to the heart that this is not just culture, organization, squad structure story. It has implications to the IT and the tooling platform as well, not just of the application itself, but to the delivery tools and how efficient you're going to be in the delivery of your application, and how much coordination you're going to have to do to achieve that kind of coordination in the deployment itself. And so I think that was a really good visual depiction of the three sort of paths that you put it here. I like that. I think we have about 10 minutes, maybe 9 minutes or so for Q&A and maybe commiseration too, based on some of the things that we've shared. Charlene, do we want to open it up or maybe take some questions from the chat?
Yes, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the questions so far. And I'm going to get the slides back up on the screen in just a second here. Let's see. So Craig is asking, how do you convince developers they should create tens or hundreds of microservices? Because and then it says, leads to extra complexity. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So there is no doubt, you use the word extra complexity. There is, I don't know of anyone that has purported that going to a microservices architecture style would simplify your landscape. That might be a bit of a stretch. So I think the fact that you use the word complexity is very apropos here. I find that actually it doesn't take a whole lot of convincing for microservices. Although we do have to make sure that we don't fall into some of the microservice anti-patterns and slip into things like nanoservices where we are decomposing too much, right? And we have, too many things that really don't have a bounded business context that is suitable for what it is you're trying to do. And Eric, we do have things like domain-driven design and, this notion around entities and value objects that help us appropriately decompose monoliths into microservices. And I find that developers actually like the thought of being in an autonomous team where they have control over design, develop, test, and delivery of their product. This is their baby, and they don't have to write 80-page run books for the operations team in order for them to deploy something into production. I don't think it takes a lot of convincing. I think the benefits of microservices are actually quite compelling. But I think we do have to make sure that we don't fall into the anti-pattern of nanoservices where we're just decomposing to the point of it not making sense.
Madness lies that way, and I think you have to look at the benefits in context of what your app's about, right? Being able to scale up various elements of our system is powerful. Being able to, go from new line of code to that running in production more quickly because we don't need to coordinate, that's really powerful. But if you're working on an app that you'll never want to release more than once a month. And, you know, it doesn't have that many people working on it. And, you know, the scale is not something you're worried about. Write a darn monolith. It'll be easier and just fine.
Yep.
And so I think you got to look at what benefits you really need, how fast you want to go, how you want to scale, those sorts of topics, and let that guide you on how much to break up your app into microservices. And that'll point you the right direction.
All right, great. Go ahead.
And just to quickly add to that, you know, I mentioned before this notion of polyglot programming. So the ability to actually, for a developer to sort of have some say in terms of the language or implementation over what the microservice is written in. So the guy that you mentioned before, Eric, that's doing microservices with COBOL can actually coexist with our .NET bigot who would like to write their microservice on that platform. And you know what? It's all good.
Andrea, are you saying that developers are highly opinionated about their technology?
I might be saying that, Eric.
Oh, I don't want to get in the middle of that one, that's for sure. Okay, we're about 4 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we have time for one more question. Let's see, there's a question here. Looks like service virtualization has to be heavily used for testing and development when we move to a microservices architecture. Actually a comment, but.
Yeah, I think the idea of service virtualization or at minimum mocking, right? So that I can make changes to my thing and test that in a degree of isolation from the rest of the system is really powerful, but it's going to be most powerful when we have a significant degree of coupling from the other services, right? If we're strongly decoupled, then I may be able to test my service in a degree of isolation, and then just put it in production, and it's going to work, right? And I have to build the production safety net around that. But I think in the real world, service virtualization and kind of microservice apps are going to discover that they are very good friends over the next couple of years. I think it's going to be huge.
All right.
Yep.
Great.
Totally agree on that one.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the questions, but I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions, and just know that Andrea and Eric will be receiving a copy of all of these questions. So hopefully somebody from their team will be more than happy to get back in touch with you after the event. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will be receiving a link after the event that will take you to the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to live on the DevOps.com website. So if you don't get the link for whatever reason, you can go over to the DevOps.com website. Just look under the webinars section, and we have a huge list of upcoming and past webinars on demand that you can access at any time. Take a look. Maybe there'll be one or two that pique your interest in addition to this one. Andrea and Eric, thank you both for joining me today. It was a really great webinar, and again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Apparently there's some sort of conflict there between PowerPoint and GoToWebinar that I never knew about before, so I apologize for that, but thank you both for your patience. I do appreciate it. And thank you also to the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon and I hope everybody has a great day. I'm signing off.